All right, so welcome everyone. This is the Intro to GTFS class today. I plan for this to be really just a good interactive workshop to get everyone in here exposed to what GTFS is. Who here has heard the term GTFS before? Show of hands. All right, so a lot of people. How many of you have ever worked with GTFS before? Anyone? Okay, so some people have worked with it a little bit. The purpose of today is mostly going to be how GTFS works and give you just a sense so that you have the underlying intuition to know exactly how everything that you're working with can be processed and really leveraged for whatever purpose you may use. So we have a question from S. Garst. Is that correct, or is that just a hand raised from yes, you've used it? I'm going to assume the latter. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is let me go ahead and share my screen, and let me start sharing. So right now, everyone should be able to see my screen. And let's see. Can I get some nods if people can see my screen? Yes? No? Yes, perfect. All right. So right over here, what is GTFS? Well, what you see on the screen right now is the page where you can download GTFS data from Septa. This is TransportationCamp Philly. We're going to use Septa for most of our examples today. You basically have an agreement, blah, 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 and you click Submit. And when you click Submit, it's going to download two files, one zip file that you can then extract on your computer that provides you something that looks like this, a Google Rail and a Google Bus. This is the structure of GTFS. GTFS officially stands for the General Transit Feed Specification. It originally stood for Google Transit Feed Specification. And the premise, yep. Someone had a question? Nope. All right. The general premise was how can we get train schedules and bus schedules into Google Maps? And that's really where this specification started, and where things have gone from there is it is now the format not only used by just about every transit app that you see, transit app, City Mapper, Google Maps, etc. It is also the basis for a lot of internal applications that transit agencies use. So be it on railroad side, transit side, subway, bus operations. This is essentially the basis for all train schedules just about anywhere in North America these days. And so understanding the specification is really key to being able to not only work with the data and figure out how to process it, but be able to do really cool things with the data as well. So what I'm going to do today is just, if we come through here, here's what some of the files look like. They're text files, but they're just a bunch of CSVs that have a bunch of different data in them. We're actually not going to really look at the files. What we're going to do is we're going to make our own GTFS entirely from scratch on what's basically a whiteboard that you see over here. So let me make this a little bigger. So what we're going to do today is start out by making a GTFS for an existing Septa route. Now we get to pick which route we want to use, and I want to use a simple one. So the route that we're going to use is going to be one of either two things, and I'll let people pick. So in the chat, go ahead and post, would you rather we use the 78 or the 91 of Septa? These are two Septa bus routes, both with very interesting profiles. The 78 or the 91. And if you don't know which is which, that's fine. They're both very unique operations. Just go ahead, someone put in the chat what your thoughts are. I see we're getting someone. All right, everyone wants the 91. All right, the 91 it is. So the 78, just so people know what they are, the 78 is essentially the IRS shuttle bus, which is when the IRS moved from Bensalem, Pennsylvania to Center City, Philadelphia. They needed a way that the employees could get in before regional rail started running. That's what the 78 is. The 91, though, is an all-time favorite for just about everyone. Why? The 91 is none other then the prison bus. The 91 is the bus that operates on Saturdays to take people to the, I think it's the Greatford State Prison during visiting hours on Saturdays. So it is the 91 bus. So what we're going to do today, strictly from scratch, is we are going to write out essentially GTFS for the 91. It's not going to be entirely accurate, but that's what we're going to use as our basis for it. So let me go ahead over here. Let me actually, just so that way we don't get the bouncing icon, I'm going to switch the screen share over for a second just to show just what we're working with. So here we go. And now, cool. All right, so what we're going to do over here is we're going to get started. And the first thing we have to do is we have to say who's running the bus. So the way that we do that is we go into our agency file. And I apologize for my handwriting, but this is our agency.txt file. The agency file is going to have, right now, just one row in it, most likely. And that agency is going to have an agency ID, and the agency ID, in this case, is going to be Septa, to say that Septa is who's running the bus. We're then going to provide some other information about any bus that's a Septa bus. For example, the website, which officially is the agency URL, and that we'll put as septa.org. And we can put some other information like the time zone, which is that it's in Eastern time, etc. I'm going to use a lot of abbreviations in the drawing, but the purpose is just to give everyone a sense of how it works and what the basis for all this data is. So this is our agency file. So right over here we have our agency.txt file. Does this make sense to everyone thus far? And it's nods, yes, okay. We've gotten the first step down. So now we know that Septa is an agency that's going to run transit information, that's going to run some transit form. The next thing that we want to do is, well, we need to make the 91 a route. And so the way that we do that, who can take a guess as to where we're going to write down that the 91 is a route? What file are we going to use to write that down? And someone put in the chat what text file we might use to say that the 91 is a route. Sorry, Asif, that's wrong. Someone want to guess, where will we put a route? Routes.txt, there we go. So you're going to see pretty soon how this works. So now we need to have a list of our routes. So in here, we're going to have routes.txt. And this is going to be our CSV file of our routes. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is put a route ID. And over here, we're going to call this route the 91. Okay, so that's the route that we have. The next thing that we can do is give it a route long name. And this route long name is going to be the long name of the bus, quite simply, of this route. So we can call this, why don't we call it the prison visitor bus. This is not the actual name of it, but this is just for our example. We're putting the route long name of the prison visitor bus. We can also do things, for example, give it a color. So if we wanted to give it, we could say it's F, 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 to say that the color of the route is white if you wanted to put it on a map. This is just a hex code for colors. If you've ever seen hex codes, it's just a representation of a color in 6 alphanumeric characters. We can then put some other bits of information about it, but for right now, here we have a route. It's the 91. Who operates the 91, though? What agency operates the 91? Anyone want to take a guess? Who runs the 91 bus? Just shout it out or put it in the chat.
Septa.
Septa. Septa runs it. Do we have anything in routes.txt right now that tells us that Septa runs the bus? No. So how we do that is we put in this row agency ID, and this agency ID is going to be Septa. And now you can start to see exactly how everything comes together. So what we just did over here, if I highlight this, is we just made agency ID Septa. And this value of agency ID is Septa. So you can kind of see things coming together over here. Let me use a big blue pen. This is how I know that this data is linked. So if I were to say, what time zone does the 91 operate in, I look in the roots to see that the root is 91, and then when I get over, I see the agency ID is Septa, and I can link from that field to the agency ID in agency.text, and then look across the row there and see that it's Eastern Time. Does that all make sense to everyone, how I made that leap from one to the next? Okay, so I'm seeing some nods. That's a good sign.
Why do you need that if you downloaded it from the Septa website already?
That's a really good question. There's a couple of different reasons as to why we define the agency. The first is there's a lot of apps out there like Transit Apps, City Mapper, Google Maps that just collect GTFS files from a bunch of different places and put them all together in their one app. So if we didn't specify this, it may download one from Septa and then another from the MTA, but both of them could have a 91 bus. This explicitly says this is the Septa 91 and this is the MTA 91. The other reason for that is you can have one GTFS compilation actually have multiple different agencies in it. And so the example there is in Boston, the MBTA system includes not just the MBTA, but the Cape Flyer train that's operated by the MBTA, but run through the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority to go out to Cape Cod. You also have scenarios in the Bay Area where they release a GTFS for basically everything, so it has SF Muni, Caltrain, etc., all in that one file. And similarly, in the Seattle area, you have King County Metro, Sound Transit, etc., who all put their data in the same GTFS file. So the reason we have to specify the agency is it's not necessarily going to be one agency in one file. The other thing to it as well, though, is that if we took a look, when I downloaded the Septa GTFS, I'm actually downloading two GTFSs, one for bus and one for rail. Both of them are Septa. So that's why we have to link them both to the agency ID. That answer your question? Yep. Cool.
Thank you.
All right. So now what we're going to do, now we have a route. So now that we know the 91 is a bus. But now what I need to do is I have to figure out, before we can run a bus, where do buses have to typically, where do they let people on and off? They let people on and off at?
Stops.
Stops, yes, exactly, stops. So now what we need to do is we need to give it some stops of where the bus can let people on or off. So this is going to be, as I'm sure you can probably start figuring out by now, stops.txt. So in this stops file, I'm going to have, what do you think the first thing to start out the stops file is? So agency started with the agency ID, route started with the route ID. What do you think stops is going to start with?
Stop ID.
Stop ID, exactly. So over here I'm going to put the stop ID as the first thing. And I'm just going to make up IDs. These are not going to be the actual IDs just for the sake of it. But we're going to make the first stop ID NTC. And then we'll add, right now we're just going to add 3 stops to the bus. We're just going to say it's an express and it makes only 3 stops. NTC is our first stop ID. Our second stop ID will be BUS, and the third stop ID will be GCI. I think that's what it is, yeah. So, all right, so these are our stop IDs. So these are the code names that we're going to use to say this is one particular stop. What I can then do is I can give each one a stop name. So this is where we describe what this stop is. So NTC is the Norristown Transportation center. This bus is random bus stop. And this last one is the correction institution. I think it's an institution. It's the prison. So right now we have the stop IDs and the stop names. So all right, that's some helpful information. What else might you want to know about a stop? You might want to know where the stop is located. In that case, we could have something like a stop lat and a stop lon. And this is where I could say this is, you know, negative 39 point whatever, and this is 70, or actually I think that's positive 39 and negative 70 something. And this is where we can give GPS coordinates for where the stop is going to be. And then we can give a whole bunch of other information. We can give information about, for example, fare zones that apply to a stop. But right now we just have the basis of this of here are the stops that we have. Okay? Now, do I have anything linking stops to routes yet? No, not yet. Because really, a route doesn't stop at a stop. It's an actual like trip of the bus that stops at the stop. So where do you think we're going to record all of the trips that we have? Where are the trips going to be recorded? Trips.txt, exactly. By now you should be able to tell my vocal inflection when I'm leading you with a question. So over here we have trips.txt. And right now, trips is going to be a key thing. This is where we're going to say what trips we're going to operate on the 91. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a trip ID. So the trip ID is going to be just some random code. So I'm going to make the first trip ID, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The second trip ID will be hello. And the third trip ID is going to be token. The trip ID doesn't really matter in this case. So over here we have our 3 trips. Let me move that over a little bit. All right, so we have our 3 trips, and let's add 3 more. How about someone give me? There's a question. Do most agencies number bus stops, or are there major agencies that do alpha codes? That's a really good question. Quite honestly, if you look at stop IDs, I'm going to come back to stop IDs for a second. The stop ID, most frequently for agencies, is just a random number that comes out of whatever database they use for planning. So, Christoph, you're probably familiar with Hastis and Trapeze. Typically, the stop ID is just the code that they use in that transportation planning system to encode that stop. In many cases, it corresponds with what might be a public-facing thing, but if you're thinking about a code that would be on a bus stop, like text for this code to whatever to find the next stops, that's a separate field called stop code. So this is where I could say NTC has a stop code of 23456, in which case the stop ID in our data is NTC, but what I would text to get the next upcoming departures that we'd print on the bus stop is 23456. And that gives a little bit more flexibility as well, because you can modify your Hastis database or whatever other database you're using and still have a point back to the same identifier that's used on the bus stop itself. It's not a requirement that both are specified. That's a good question mark. However, quite honestly, some people specify all of them. Some people specify none of them. Some people just put an ID. Some people make an ID that's just the name of a station, but there's not as much flexibility there in that case. So best practice tends to be make an ID something about where the stop is located that's not going to change. For example, if a station is renamed, that way you don't have to rename the ID of it. The code is something you would post somewhere. And our trip files, no. So we're just going through another question that came up from Jackson is Is it just typically limited to one route? No, we're just drawing this out for one route. The actual files that we'll explore once we go through this demo, you'll see have information for basically every bus route, every bus trip, every possibility all together in one collection of GTFS. And then the question of how does it serve things serving both routes and directions, I'll come back to. But long story short, you can have two things. One is you can, typically best practices, each bus stop physically is a separate stop, but then there's, if we're going to get really ahead of myself here, there's another thing called, there's another one called parent station, and that would allow us to say that the bus is stopping at berth A of the Norristown Transportation Center, and the berth A stop is a child stop that is a parent to big Norristown Transportation Center. So we'll come back into those in a little bit more detail. So right now we have the trips, and let me also just check the timing of this. We have until 12:25. All right. So over here, if I come back over to our trips, so here's our first trip ID. And so what we're going to do now is we have a trip ID. We're going to make a trip head sign. And the trip head sign refers to what's going to be shown on the front of the bus. So if the bus would say something like 91 prison, we would put prison. Or if it's going to say 91 visitors, it would say visitors. The head sign is just what we're going to show on the front of the bus. That is essentially the name of the trip, if you will. We're then also going to have another element in here, which is going to be, we can give it a trip short name. And the trip short name is valuable in the case especially of commuter trains that have, this is train number 301 or something. This is where you could give a particular number for it. And then in the bus world, another thing that's very valuable is you can give block ID, and that'll let you specify the block ID of a bus. A block, for those who don't know, in transit systems typically refers to a collection of trips operated by one bus in a sequence. So for example, you're going to do this trip, then this, then this, then this. And with this standard, it essentially will also allow you to link together those trips in the data, as well as be something for people to reference in the bottom of the bus. But so right now we made our new trips, but there's nothing, again, linking our trips to our routes just yet, because we have to say that all of these trips are operated by the 91. And the way we do that is we add route ID to all of these trips, and our route ID for all of these is going to be 91, 91, 91. And because we now have 91 here, and you can kind of see how we're going to piece this together, with 91 over here in the routes, this allows us to say, all right, all of these trips are the 91, which I can link over here to our routes, is the 91. And then I now know, because the 91 is a Septa route, it's Eastern time zone. So this is the way that I could see, for example, what is the website I should go to for information about this trip? Well, if I trace it through, this trip is on the 91, which then we'd come all the way over here to the 91, which is a Septa trip, which septa.org. So is this all starting to make sense of how we link all the information together between these files? So now we actually have to say where the trip is going to stop. What do you think we're going to use to say where the trip is going to stop? What's that file going to be? Anyone want to take a guess?
Destination.
No.
Yes.
Close. Where's the trip going to stop?
Stop.
Well, we already have a stop file. Where's the trip going to stop?
Trip stop.
Trip stops. There you go. So now we're going to have this new file over here, trip stops.txt. And what this is going to do, this is actually one of the few files we're going to see over here that does not begin with a trip stop ID. And the reason is all of the data in this row is just a combination of other things for the most part, except, well, to an extent. Actually, I take back what I said. The reason is it sort of has two values to it. the first thing in trip stops is we have to give it a trip. So in this case, we're going to say this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, sorry, it would help if I actually wrote down what this field is. We have to give it a trip ID. So this is saying trip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop ID is going to stop at NTC, and then what I can do is now in my stop times I'm going to give the arrival time and the departure time. So over here we're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops at Norristown Transportation Center at let's say 9 a.m. and it's going to depart at 9 a.m. Okay, so right now what we just did in trip stops is we said that trip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we can link over to here, is going to stop at stop ID NTC, which I can link over to here, is the Norristown Transportation Center. Let me actually do a different highlight just to make this a little clearer. Let me do blue. NTC is going to link over here, and that's how I know this is trip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is going to stop at the Norristown Transportation Center at 9 a.m. Does this row make sense thus far? Yes? Okay. Now, what's the next stop we're going to make? Well, it's going to be 1, 2, change my pen here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is then going to stop at our random bus stop at 9:10 a.m. And then it's going to stop at the prison, which I think we said is GCI, at 9:30, we'll say. Okay, so right now what we just did is in trip stops, we essentially now have a bus and a lot of information about it. We know that there is a single trip called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That trip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which let me bring over my gray highlighter over here. 1, 2, 3, nope, not the eraser. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the bus to the prison. I can then see that it's a 91 bus, which I then know is the prison visitor bus. And I know that it's operated by Septa. It's going to stop at the Norristown Transportation Center at 9 a.m. Then that same trip is going to stop at random bus stop at 9:10 a.m. And then that same trip is going to stop at the correctional institution at 9:30. Does this all make sense how we're putting all the pieces together to be able to link all of this data? All right, I'm getting some thumbs up, so this is good. Now that we have all of this together, that's a full trip. We have a full trip. Who knows when this bus is going to run? No one, because we haven't actually said when the bus is going to run. And the way that we do that is we have to go into, where do you typically look to see, days of a week? What's that called?
Calendar?
A calendar, yes, exactly. So let's go to our calendar .txt. And what we're going to do here is calendar is actually going to begin with something known as a service ID. And what our service ID is going to be is over here, we're going to call this, let's say, Saturday bus service. And then now in the service ID, we're going to have, I'm going to use some abbreviations here, but we'll have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So Saturday bus service is not going to run on Monday, not Tuesday, not Wednesday, not Thursday, not Friday, yes on Saturday, not Sunday. So what we just did over here, again, is we said the service ID Saturday bus service is not going to run any day of the week except for Saturdays. Then we need to give it a start date and an end date. and we can make this 2021-01-02 and 2021-06-30. So right now, who can tell me when this bus 12345 is going to run? No one can tell me anything because I haven't actually said 12345 is a part of Saturday bus service yet. So what we do over here is I have to come in here. Here's our next field that we're going to add to our trips file, or sorry, not trip stops, in trips. And this is going to be our service ID. And this is Saturday bus service. So now what I can do is now I have my link to go from Saturday bus service in our service ID over to this in our calendars. So now, with all of this linking together, I know that on every Saturday between January 2nd, 2021 and June 30th, 2021 inclusive, I know that there will be a Route 91 bus, which is operated by Septa, to the prison that will make stops at the Norristown Transportation Center at 9 a.m., our random bus stop at 9:10 a.m., and the prison at 9:30 a.m. Does all of this make sense, how it all pieces together, of how everything comes together? Okay. The one last big critical file in GTFS to know about is calendar dates. And this is one that messes a lot of people up. Calendar dates is a very, very simple concept. What happens when it's a holiday? Well, sometimes the bus runs a different schedule. So all we would do in this case is we have our service ID, a date, and an exception type. And all this says is, if I went in here, how many times do you know that like there's a holiday on a Monday where they run a Saturday bus service? Well, let's say that we're going to run this bus on Memorial Day, and Memorial Day this year is May 31st. All that I would do is say Saturday bus service on 2021-05-31, type 1. Type 1 means add, whereas type 2 would be subtract. So in other words, if I had another row over here, let's say that it was weekday bus service, I'll just call it weekday 1111100, and this will be, we'll just say the same dates. What this tells me is that on Memorial Day, the weekday bus is going to run unless I remove it by saying weekday 2021-05-31 2. And that tells me get rid of the relevant information for that day and replace it with the Saturday bus schedule. This all makes sense thus far? Okay, so there's a bunch of other GTFS files that exist as well. For example, there's one called frequencies.txt. This essentially allows you to say, I could refer to trip ID 12345 and say 12345 starts at 9 a.m. and then run it every hour thereafter until this time. That allows some agencies that run a consistent bus service that might just operate on a fixed headway. They only have to define the trip and trip stops once, and then can essentially tell people, just copy and paste that trip every 60 minutes, or every 15 minutes, or every 5 minutes. Realistically, that's not as widely used because most people just have it come straight out of their transit planning and scheduling system, which typically has each individual trip in there, whereas for other instances, you may see other different types of files in here. For example, you may see information about fares and transfer data as well, being able to say there's a timed connection, let's say from the Norristown high-speed line, the Route 100, over to this bus. You can link in and say this line connects with this line at this place, or this stop connects to this stop at this place, or there is a time transfer between these two trips, etc. One last thing that I realized I skipped over, which was kind of important in the routes, is the concept of the route ID, or route type. And I believe bus is 1. I'm not a bus person, really. I'm more of a rail person, so I could tell you if we said route type is 2, that would say it's a commuter rail train. If it's 0, that would say it's a subway or a subway. I believe 1 is bus or 3 is bus. There's a value for bus, ferry, subway, etc. So it's a really open standard. The standard is fully available online if you search for GTFS. What I'm going to do now, though, in the remaining, what do we have? The remaining 3 minutes, but then it's lunch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen again and show a little bit more, just to show you how those files that we saw play into everything else. So let's apply changes, and now we should see. Did I call it trip stops? Yes, sorry, that's my bad. It's stop times. I don't know why I called it trip stop. I know why I called it trip stops. I called it trip stops because in Hastis it's a trip stop. It is stop times. Thank you. Thank you for catching that, Asif. That was a big, big error on my part.
No problem.
Stop times. All right. And thank you for also posting the specification in there. Just to take a look at some of the questions that we have in the chat over here. I talked a little bit about the stops. Yeah, typically you'd have 1 for each direction. A bus that crosses time zones or a train that crosses time zones, you can then override the time zone by adding a stop time zone field to say this stop is in this time zone. So for example, NICTY, the South Shore commuter rail line from Indiana to Chicago, operates in 2 different time zones. So they have to say the South Bend stops are in the Eastern time zone, whereas everything else defaults to the Chicago time zone, Central Time. To the question, would you need both the weekday subtract and the Saturday add for Memorial Day? Yes, indeed. So now let me go ahead and show you the Septa files that we looked at, and this should make some sense based on what we did. Let's take a look at Septa's Google Bus scenario, and let me open this up in Sublime. So if I take a look, here's our agency, so we can see that this is Septa, and I'm using a different computer, otherwise this would be nicely color-coded for me. We can see that here's Septa. I can then go into our routes, and if I find the 91, here is our 91 bus, which is between the prison and Norristown Transportation Center. Its route type is 3, which says it's a bus. Then we can go into our trips file, and here we can find everywhere that we have a 91 trip. And here are the 6 trips, the 3 round trips where the 91 operates. You can see over here we have all the information about the service ID, which is a service ID up here you can see of 30, which tells us that it's grouped in with the 30 service ID. Then I can see the individual trip IDs. Here are the head signs. We then also have a shape file, shapes.txt, which is essentially a set of GPS coordinates that allows us to map out on a map exactly where a given bus is going to go. So that shape file gives me the GPS coordinates of where that bus is going to go on a map. But then here's, let's take this first trip. Now if I come into stop times, and stop times typically is your largest file in here. If I search for our trip, here you can see here's all the stops the bus is going to make. So this trip is going to stop somewhere at 2:20 p.m., then 2:21, 2:22, etc. And here's all the stops that this bus is going to make. We also then see the stop sequence field, which tells us this is the first stop, second, third, etc. We then see here's one of the stops, so I'll take the first one, is stop 1649. If I go into stops and search for stop 1649, Stop 1649 is Norristown Transportation Center, and then here's the GPS coordinates of where it's located, and we can repeat that process exactly as we discussed. And then the calendar, the service ID was 30, so if we come over here, 30 we see for a service ID corresponds with operating Saturdays only from March 21st through June 5th of 2021. And 30 also, there are no exceptions for 30. So 30 is never added nor removed. So it's just going to be on those Saturdays that we referenced. That is the very high-level overview of your intro to GTFS. I'm going to pause for questions, even though I believe we're at time. We're over time by 2 minutes, but lunch is coming up. So if anyone is interested in staying on, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And yes, I can clarify the exception and favorite tools, yes. For those who do want to drop off now and go to lunch, thank you for joining. I hope this was a valuable and informative session for you. To the question of add relative to what, so we can have multiple service IDs in effect at a given time. So just because something, if I come back over to this, if I open up calendar, you can see some of these can overlap. So I can have multiple service IDs in effect on at essentially one time. So I could have these service IDs running, and then what I need to say is, okay, now I'm going to remove this one service ID for the holiday and then add back in this other service ID for the holiday. Favorite tools for editing and viewing GTFS feeds. I have to say I'm a little biased because I built my own GTFS creator from Hastis data, so I'm a little biased in that regard because I don't like the native one that they use, mostly just for what I do at work. We have some obscure things that require some elements above and beyond the standard data that you might get directly from something out of Hastis. But a great website is Transitland. I believe they renamed themselves. That allows you to essentially go on, actually we can pull it up over here, Transitland. If I go to Transitland and search for Septa, what this will allow me to do, they essentially aggregate GTFS data from just about everyone. And if I search for Septa over here, let's go to Rail. Oh, it's loading. When it loads, what it's going to do is it's going to, let me search Transitland Septa, and we'll do it this way. Nope, well, it doesn't want to load. When it does feel like loading, it provides you a really nice way to view GTFS data in sort of an online web viewer. Any other questions that I missed? Nope, I think that covered it. Any questions you guys have now, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a quick question. I don't know what's new to this, and this was very helpful. What are some more resources that are kind of on this level of someone explaining it the way you just did?
Quite honestly, there aren't that many, and the reason, that's honestly how this came to be. This is not the first time I've done this demo. I've done it both for clients as well as for various individuals at other transportation camps in the past. So it's not necessarily something new, but it is indeed something that is, there's a need for more of these sort of like intro resources to get started. Honestly, the best way that I'd say is just download a GTFS package for a transit agency you're familiar with, but don't start with one that's like insanely huge. If you live in New York, don't start with the MTA. Google like your small town's local little bus service, or even some colleges of a GTFS service. You can look, a lot of places will have really small GTFS files. Granted, they're not the greatest because they often have, they don't have the staffing and resources to maintain something the same way that you would if it's a full-blown agency that has dedicated resources for it. But otherwise, play around with it, explore the data, and try working on something that you find of interest. I know that personally, I've just, most people learn GTFS by brute force of just playing around with things and making cool things with it. I've made...
You need to mute yourself.
I'm sorry? Can people hear me?
So far, so good.
Okay, I heard you need to unmute yourself, but if people can hear me, we're good. That's essentially what I would recommend and suggest for getting started with GTFS. Beyond that, it's really difficult to say where the best next resource would be. But sort of the next phase once you master GTFS is GTFS real-time, which essentially says, here's GTFS data that we're well aware of, and now what we want to do is we want to say, well, the bus is actually going to arrive at this particular time 3 minutes late, or here's the GPS coordinate of the bus, and go from there. So that's essentially what it all boils down to of how GTFS can be used. Did I lose people? Can people hear me?
We're here.
Okay, awesome. I can't see you now for some reason. My screen went black when I stopped sharing, but there we go. Okay. Yeah, any other questions you folks have? Nope. All right, well then thank you all for joining. Hopefully this was valuable. Hopefully everyone learned something here. This session has been recorded, and let me rephrase that. I believe it's been recorded. I clicked the record button. What we're going to do is take the recordings. All of the recordings will be posted on YouTube after the conference. And by after the conference, I mean after I and the rest of the organizing team crash for a couple of days and then download everything and get it online. But when that's online, check Slack. We'll make sure that it's available in Slack, and you'll be able to access this if there's anything you want to reference again. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for coming to Transportation Camp.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.